This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Since World War II, the world has been split into two blocks. Those countries that use American weapons and those countries that use Soviet or Russian weapons. The two countries have been by far and away the biggest arms exporters for most of modern history. But while America is still selling just as many weapons as ever, in the last couple of years, Russia's arms exports have declined sharply, with little prospect of recovery. So in this video, we're going to look at why no one's buying Russian arms anymore, why the Russian army's lackluster performance in Ukraine hasn't helped things, and why this is all bad news for Putin. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, to understand quite how catastrophic this decline in arms exports is for Russia, you need to understand quite how big a player Russia was in the arms exports business. For most of modern history, arms exports have been dominated by just two countries, America and Russia, or before 1990, the Soviet Union. The numbers vary, but basically every year since 1960, the two countries have accounted for at least 50%, and usually more than 75% of all arms exports, with France, the UK, and more recently China accounting for the remainder. Historically, Russia's main customers have been former Soviet states, India and China, while the US's main customers have been other NATO members, Saudi Arabia and Japan. More recently, an increasing fraction of US arms sales have gone to allies in the Asia-Pacific, like Australia, South Korea and Taiwan. These arms exports have been great for Russia, not just because they provide Russia with a valuable source of foreign currency, accounting for something like 3% of all exports, but also because commercial arms relationships are really effective forms of soft power. This is because if a country buys Russian arms, then it will also rely on Russian companies for spare parts and maintenance, which means that it can't really afford to upset the Kremlin unless it wants to completely revamp its military by transitioning to American weapons, which costs lots of money. This is one of the reasons why India, for example, has been so reluctant to criticize Russia over Ukraine. India has been one of Russia's main customers for years, and it's estimated that between 70 and 80% of India's military equipment is of Russian or Soviet origin. If India took a more hawkish stance against Russia or Ukraine, then Russia could either stop selling India arms, in which case it wouldn't be able to upgrade its military without an expensive conversion to American systems, or even refuse to sell spare parts or perform maintenance on India's Russian-made systems, which would steadily erode India's military abilities. Obviously, India doesn't want this, not least because India-China relations are on the rise at the moment, and there's now a non-zero chance of a full-fledged border conflict. Anyway, while US and Soviet arms sales were pretty even during the Cold War, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US has usually outsold Russia. However, there was a point in the early 2010s when it looked like Russia might overtake the US, thanks to increased demand from India, China and Syria. In 2013, for example, Russia actually momentarily overtook the US, with $7.9 billion worth of sales to the US's $7.6 billion. However, in the past few years, Russia's arms exports have begun to decline steeply. In 2018, for example, Russia sold $7.2 billion worth of arms internationally. In 2019, this had declined to $5.6 billion. By 2020, it had fallen to $3.9 billion. In 2021, it hit a new low of $2.86 billion. Unsurprisingly, Russia's arms exports declined further in 2022 to just $2.82 billion, largely because the Kremlin couldn't afford to sell weapons it needed to the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. This means that Russia is now behind not just the US, but also France, who exported just over $3 billion worth of arms in 2022. To make matters worse, in 2022, Russia sold arms to just 12 countries. For context, in the early 2010s, at the peak of Russia's arms boom, Russia was selling to more than 30 countries in any one year. Now, it's tempting to blame this precipitous drop on the pandemic and Ukraine, but this doesn't really add up. Countries don't only buy arms during conflicts. Arms deals are usually multi-year contracts that require constant expenditure, which is why America's military sales didn't really decline during the pandemic in the way that Russia's did. The US sold $10.8 billion worth of arms in 2019, $9.4 billion in 2020, and then $11 billion in 2021. Similarly, while the war in Ukraine might have temporarily reduced Russia's available stockpiles, it was also an opportunity to showcase its military hardware to potential customers. Again, it's worth comparing with the US here. America's HIMARS system have proven so effective in Ukraine that they've seen a sharp spike in orders. Since the war began, Australia, Taiwan and Poland have all announced their intention to buy more, and Germany has announced a joint project with Lockheed to create a German version of the system. Instead, Russia's lackluster military performance in Ukraine has had the opposite effect, and actually deterred potential customers. Serbian Prime Minister Aleksandar Vučić, for example, explicitly acknowledged this in November, when he told Serbian media that Russia's retreat in Kherson demonstrated that Serbia needs to, quote, create its own future and take care of its military sense, while Armenia, which has complained both about Russia failing to fulfill weapons deliveries and about Russia not helping Armenia defend against Azerbaijan's recent aggression, is now buying arms from India instead of Russia. However, it's not just the Russian army's lackluster performance in Ukraine that's undermining its arms exports. After all, Russia's arms sales were declining in 2019, well before Russia's full-on invasion. The other big reason Russia's arms sales have been declining is China and India. While they were developing countries without domestic military sectors, both India and China relied heavily on Soviet and Russian imports. However, as the two countries' economies have grown, their domestic military capacity has grown as well, and both countries have started trying to wean themselves off Russian tech, both because they don't want to be dependent on Russia, and because they think they can make better systems themselves. This is why Russian exports to India has fallen from nearly $4 billion in 2013 to $1.3 billion today. And Russian exports to China have fallen from nearly $2 billion in 2018 to just over $700 billion today. Not only are India and China reducing their Russian imports, they're also replacing Russia as the supplier of choice for developing countries. China's arms exports have risen from basically nothing in the 90s to over $2 billion today. And as we mentioned a second ago, India is replacing Russia in Armenia. Obviously, this is bad news for Russia. Not only does it mean less revenue for Russian arms manufacturers and the Kremlin, but it massively erodes Russia's soft power. Arms exports were one of the few areas where Russia really looked like a superpower, and the developing world's dependence on Russia and Soviet tech afforded the Kremlin enormous leverage. Unfortunately for Putin, if arms exports continue to decline further, which looks likely, this will only accelerate Russia's geopolitical retreat. What do the world's best politicians have in common? They're willing to learn something new every day. And if you think that sounds too hard or too time-consuming, or even just too overwhelming for you to do, then you haven't tried Brilliant.org. Brilliant.org is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. That's because Brilliant has literally thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to skills crucial in the modern world, like AI, data science, neural networks, and more, with new lessons added monthly. Like I said though, the real value here is that you can do this easily every day, truly committing to lifelong learning. Slowly, over time, you'll not only pick up new skills or get better at maths, but you'll also feel the satisfaction that comes with bettering yourself and staying ahead. To try everything Brilliant has to offer, free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription.